Okay, Be'ez Hashem, today's daf is Daf Chav Vav. We are beginning Daf Chav Hey Amud Beis, approximately, I would say, about six, seven, eight, nine lines from the top, 9 lines from the bottom. Sorry, by Rebbe Reb Chia. Okay, you can see it on your screen over here. Let me move this aside. Rebbe Reb Chia. Okay, very simple. We're continuing on with this discussion. So let's say this discussion concerns itself that let's say you have a guy who lived in the five towns, okay, and everybody knew his family. He's a kohen. He leaves, and let's say he leaves for a period of time. Nobody knows where he goes, and then he shows back up, and he has a son next to him over bar mitzvah, and he says, "Hey, this is my son." So we don't know where his son comes from. Maybe he adopted somebody, a goy, and made him into a Jew. How do you know that that person's a kohen? So that's the discussion over here. His father is saying, "This is my son." So Rebbe Reb Chia, both Rebbe and Reb Chia, Chad, one of them, Hela Bain, made a son al pi aviv according to the testimony of his father. Lekahuna, he made him a kohen. Okay, his father said, "This is my boy." And he's a kohen. And we know the father is a kohen. That's the point. We know the father is a kohen, but maybe you would think that he's like he's biased over here. We wouldn't trust him. So no, one of them said it's okay. One of them actually made his brother into his brother, the Levi. In other words, we know for a fact somebody's a Levi. And this guy says, "Hey, let me introduce you to my brother. He is really my brother, and therefore he's a Levi as well." So that's what they did. Even though basically it's relatives saying edus that these people are either a kohen or a Levi, but we don't know who said what. What was it, Rebbe or Reb Chia? Which one of them made a boy a kohen? Which one of them made a boy a Levi? So the Gemara says, "Tistayim, I will prove it to you." The Rebbe Hela Bain al pi aviv lekahuna. Rebbe was the one that made a boy according to the testimony of his father. He made him into a kohen, because the Tanya we learned in a brisa. Harei sheba v'omar. A man comes and says, "B'ni zeh, this is my boy, the kohen who he's a kohen." So ne'eman lahachiloi betruma. You are permitted to now give him truma, the boy. You don't know anything about the boy. Who's telling you he's a kohen? His father, who we know for a fact is a kohen. He's telling you he's my son. You can give him truma. You're allowed to allow him to eat truma. But again, the einoi nema lahasiya isha. You can't let him marry a girl, as we spoke about yesterday. To marry a Jewish girl, you have to have two witnesses, kosher witness, say for a fact that he's not a mamzer, he's not a nosin, he's not somebody who's prohibited from marrying a Jewish girl. So the father is not believed in that respect. He's only believed to even feed his son truma, but he has to find another two eidim if he wants to marry this boy, if he wants to get this boy married. Divrei Rebbe, because Yuchsin is very strict. Amoloi Reb Chia. So Rebbe was the one that actually seems to have been the one involved making a boy a kohen. So Reb Chia said to Rebbe, "Im atomaminoy lahachile betruma." If you believe him for truma, if you believe the father for truma, taminoy lahasiya isha, then you should allow him to marry a woman. But if you don't believe the father to allow this boy to marry a Jewish girl, don't believe him to have the boy eat truma, because truma is daraisa. Eating truma is a big thing. So if you believe him for the truma, you should believe him for the marriage also. And if not, don't believe him for the truma either. So Reb Chia seems to be very strict, and Reb Chia seems to say that you wouldn't even believe him for truma. You wouldn't believe him for truma. Now, so therefore, Reb Chia's scenario was he permitted a Levi to say testimony on his brother that he is also a Levi, because that's Ma'aser Rishon, and that's not such a big avera, because Ma'aser Rishon is permitted to even a non-Levi to eat. Amalei. But anyway, Rebbe responded to Reb Chia, "Ani ma'amina la'achile betruma." I believe the father to allow this boy to eat truma, The father, without asking any questions, has the power to feed his son truma, because he could take him home and in the privacy of his home start giving him truma, and who's going to stop him? I cannot believe in to allow this boy to marry a Jewish girl. It's not in his power to have this boy marry a girl. You need the consent of the girl. You need the bezdin to ascertain if it's a kosher marriage. So that's why Rebbe stuck with his guns and he says, you know what, I'm going to just believe him to say that the father's correct, that he's a kohen, and anybody can give him truma. Anybody, if somebody who wants to give truma on his food, he can give it to this boy. But again, if they allow this boy to marry your daughter, that you wouldn't do. This time, that's the proof that Rebbe was involved with the boy that was a kohen. Since Rebbe was the one that brought a boy according to the testimony of his father to be a kohen, he brought a brother according to the testimony of another brother, Lelevia, to bring a Levi. So the Gemara asks a question: why would Reb Chia allow that? And even a brother, if Reb Chia has a problem with relatives saying testimony against testimony on behalf of a relative, like the father saying testimony that on behalf of his son that he is a kohen, so then why would a Reb Chia allow one brother to say testimony about the other brother that he's a Levi? Reb Chia, let's understand Reb Chia. Reb Chia seems to have a problem with what Rebbe did. Rebbe allowed a father to say testimony about his son that he's a kohen. Maishno ben Deloi. Why was Reb Chia saying about the son, that the father is not a good witness to say that his son is a kohen? The Karev who eats a lover, because the boy is a relative to his father, so his father cannot be counted on to say to be the one to say that he's a kohen. He's a relative. Achnami Karev who eats al but wouldn't you say a brother also is a relative to another brother? And therefore, one brother saying about the other brother that he's a Levi should also not be believed, according to the Rabbi Chia's understanding, that relatives should not be believed. We go to Daf Chof Vav Amud Aleph. Answers the Gemara, you're right, a relative would not be believed. According to Rabbi Chia is very strict. Don't trust relatives to say that my relative is a Kohen or Levi. Doesn't work. But in the case where Reb Chia allowed one brother to talk about another brother, is b'mesiach lefi tumai, when the brother was talking offhandedly. He wasn't saying edis. Actually, he was just having a private conversation with somebody, and the topic came up that so-and-so is my brother, and he must be a Levi as well. So in that case, since he wasn't cornered into a testimony, he's actually offhandedly making this remark, then we can take it and run with it and say that he is a Levi. Where do you see that sometimes when you say testimony, we don't believe you. But when you say something offhandedly, like, you're just having a conversation, we take you seriously and we can run with the idea. Kiha, like the following case. Damar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Maaseh ba'odam echad. There was a story about a young man, right? Shahaya masiach lefi tumai. He was speaking in an offhanded way, and he was just recollection. He made a recollection. Maybe he was not from. Okay, he doesn't know the difference. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. He grew up forgetting everything, but he's recollecting how it was in his home when he was growing up as a yeshiva boy. And he said, Zucharani kishani tinok. I remember when I was a young kid, let's say 3 years old, umurkav al kaseifoy shel abba. And my father put me on his shoulders because he didn't want me to become tamei. Vaytziuni mi beis haseifer, and took me out of cheder, my yeshiva, and I'm like in the kindergarten class, and he's carrying me, and he's obviously saying that I'm not a slave, I'm actually a Jewish kid, and because I was already in cheder. And I remember my father, v'shituni eskutanti, took off my shirt and brought me to this place where there's a pool, and biluni, and he toiveled me in the mikvah, and then le'echol betruma be'erev, and he told me we're going to eat truma after dark. After you go to the mikvah as a kohen, you have to wait till nightfall. And the reason why a small kid is considered tamei, because he plays in the garbage, and maybe he touched a sheretz that made him tamei. So he's saying in an offhanded way, not that I'm a kohen. He's just saying that a story about his father, taking him to the mikvah. And I think we ate truma at night, and it was in an offhanded way. Rab Chia Masayimba, Rab Chia continued on with the story. That the man continued saying, my friends in the cheder, stayed away from me. After I came back from the mikvah, they put me aside. They didn't want to go near me. They would call me Yochanan Oichel Chalas. Yochanan, that was his name, and he said he eats truma. Oichel Chalas. Chalas is like truma. So he is saying the story in an offhanded way, not as a testimony. The hello Rabbi Kahuna Piv. Rabbi made him a kohen based on his storytelling. So same thing over here. Reb Chia never allowed one relative to say testimony about another relative that he's a Levi or a kohen. But if one relative was just schmoozing with somebody, shooting the breeze, and then this, a story came up which indicated that this person that he's talking about is a Levi, so then Reb Chia believed him. Because Masiach B'Lipi Tumai seems to be more honest than just, an outright edus. Tanya Nugamara. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, Geshem shetruma chazaka l'kuhuna. Just like if you see a man, he's eating truma, right? You can assume the presumptive status is he's a kohen. Whatever that means. And some say that you could even allow him to marry a Jewish girl. Some say not. But maybe you could even allow him to eat challah d'oraisa. But seeing somebody eating truma is somewhat proof that he is a kohen. Says the Brisa, in the name of Reb Shimon ben Elazar, kach, so also ma'aser rishon chazaka l'kuhuna. If you see somebody eating ma'aser rishon, you can assume that he's a kohen. So right away you're going to jump on me and say, wait a second, ma'aser rishon is only eaten by a Levi. We'll discuss that in a second. If Bezdin allows somebody to take part in collecting, truma, and Bezdin gave him a certificate, you could collect truma, Eina Chazaka, that's not proof that he's a kohen. That also doesn't make sense, because if Bezdin gives you the proof that you could collect truma, certainly you should be a kohen. So let's examine the two statements that don't make too much sense in this brisa. Ma'aser rishon, if you see him eating ma'aser rishon, you assume his presumptive status is a kohen. The Levi, it's a Levi. He must be a Levi, not a kohen. Answers the Gemara, Rab Elazar ben Azariah, that this brisa goes according to Rab Elazar ben Azariah that a kohen could also eat ma'aser rishon. Briefly, the truma is, when you have a basket of tevel, the first thing is you give to the kohen. The next 10% you give to the Levi. But Rab Elazar ben Azariah's opinion is that you could also give it to the kohen. The Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, truma l'kohen, the truma is supposed to be given to a kohen. Ma'aser rishon, the 10% after that belongs to the Levi, Divrei Rabbi Akiva, and it could only be given to a Levi. Rab Elazar ben Azariah, Rab Elazar ben Azariah says, Ma'aser rishon af l'kohen. Ma'aser rishon could also be given to a kohen. So therefore, when you see a person basically eating ma'aser rishon, the Brisa says we can presume that he is a kohen, because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that ma'aser rishon can be also given to a kohen. So the Gemara jumps on that answer. When the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that a kohen could eat truma, it means afla kohen, also a kohen could eat truma, but a Levi could also eat truma. Of course, l'kohen v'lo Levi mi amar. Did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say you give it only to the kohen and not to the Levi? So how do you assume that if you see somebody eating ma'aser rishon, he's a kohen? He could still be a Levi, and very well, that's the main mitzvah is to give it to a Levi. Answers the Gemara it's possible that there was a certain period of time that you would not give ma'aser rishon to the Levi. Basar de kansuhu Ezra. After Ezra punished the Leviim, they were no more giving ma'aser rishon to the Levi, they were giving it to the kohen. What does that mean? That means that when Ezra started to gather people to help him rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash, and he was trying to get the best people to come with him to build the Beis Hamikdash, the Leviim stayed behind. Very few Leviim showed up. And therefore, Ezra said, when I get this Beis Hamikdash built, I'm going to make a fine that you, from now on, nobody who's growing produce in Israel should give their Meiserishin to the Levi. So after he made that punishment, people were only giving Meiserishin only to the Kohen. So if you see somebody eating Meiserishin, you could presume that he is certainly a Kohen for other dinim as well. Probably you could call him the Kohen, you could give him the first aliyah, you could allow him to duchen. So the Gemara asks a question. Okay, even if you're telling me it's the period of time after Ezra punished the Levium, the Dilma Ikra v'Yahavile, but maybe you don't know for sure it's a Kohen. Maybe a Levi showed up, and the guy who owned the produce doesn't know and gave it to this person, and he was a Levi. You don't know for certain that he was a Kohen. Perhaps a Levi showed up, and the guy doesn't know about the fines of Ezra and was giving his Meiserishin to a Levi. So how do you know 100% that if you see a guy eating Meiserishin, he's a Kohen? Amar Rav Chizda, so Rav Chizda explained the Brayta, so you're right. In normal cases, we cannot assume that he's a for sure Kohen. Perhaps he's a Levi. But here, the Bryce is talking about we know that this person that is eating Meiser Rishon, his father was a Kohen, so we can assume that he also is a Kohen. So what's the problem? What do I need him to eat Meiser Rishon? His father was a Kohen, so he's a Kohen. What do I need further proof? The answer is Unafak Alei Kala. There was a rumor in the newspapers that Ben Grusha Ben Chalutzahu, that his father married a divorcee or a chalutza, and therefore he is a chalal. He's not a kohen with kedusha. He lost his kedusha. But then you see that this person is getting ma'aser rishon by the granaries. So then we see that he's collecting ma'aser rishon. So he must be not just a kohen chalal. He must be a real kosher kohen, because otherwise people would not give him their ma'aser rishon. Levi, for certainly the Lav Levi, he's certainly not a Levi. But what do you have a problem with this guy? Ben Gerusha, Ben Chalutza, that he's a son of a Gerusha or Chalutza, and he's a Chalal. If he's a Chalal, that means he has no Kedusha, he's like a regular Jew. Of course, according to the opinion that Meiser Rishon cannot be eaten by a non-Kohen or non-Levi, certainly nobody would give him the Meiser Rishon if he was really a Ben Gerusha, Ben Chalutza. The Lo Yahavile, nobody would give him their Meiser Rishon. Ella afilu madiyama Meiser Rishon mutal lazarim. Even according to the opinion that Meiser Rishon, any person can eat Meiser Rishon, so any Yisrael can eat Meiser Rishon. Yes, that would not establish that he is a kosher kohen. But Hani Mili, when is a Jew permitted to eat Meiser Rishon? Lemispaklahu. If you give him, he's allowed to eat Meiser Rishon. Ava b'toyres chaluka, but to give him as the portion of the produce, give it to this person, you have to give it to a Levi or a kosher kohen. And therefore, if he was a chalal, lo yahavile, they would not have given to him. But the fact that you see that he showed up, this guy who has a rumor on his head that he's a kohen, but he lost his kedusha of a kohen because his father married a gerusha, so he's a chalal. But then you see that he shows up and people are giving him Meiser Rishon. So you can assume that the olam knows, the world knows, the people who know him know that he's not really a chalal. This is a bad rumor that somebody spread on him. And therefore you could assume he's a kohen, and you could make him a kohen, and therefore he can become a kohen in other matters, like in duchening and things like that. The Gemara Mishnah, the Brisa also continued and said, "Ba'choilid bebezdin eina chazaka." Somebody who takes from Bezdin, if Bezdin gives him a right to collect, that's not a chazaka. That doesn't establish him as a kohen, right? So the Gemara says, if Bezdin gives him the right to collect from the granaries truma, that's not an establishment that he's a kohen. How do you establish somebody as a kohen? He has the sheet from Bezdin. Bezdin is allowing him to collect the truma. Answers the Gemara, we're talking about a specific case. A guy died. Okay, he was a kohen, and he had two boys. All right, one of the boys is a regular kohen, and one of the boys, we don't know if he's a kohen because maybe the father married a gerusha, and this other boy who's from another marriage is a chalal. So Bezdin will say that, look, you're dividing up the father's assets, and therefore even the chalal should be able to inherit some truma from his father. Doesn't mean he could eat it. That's why it says Eina Chazaka. That doesn't establish him as a kohen. It just means he could inherit some truma from his father, the real kohen, and he still has to prove in other ways that he's a kohen, not a ben gerusha and chalutza. So hachikama hacholik truma benichsei aviv. Somebody who's divvying up the truma from the possessions of his father, who was a real kohen, and he's doing it in echav with other brothers who are real kahanim, but he is the only doubtful kohen because maybe his mother was a grusha, and they're doing it bezdin. And bezdin says you can give this person truma. So eina chazaka, that's not doesn't establish him full as a kohen. They're just saying he should inherit some truma. What's he going to do with that truma if he can't eat it? He's going to sell it. But that doesn't establish him just because he's inheriting truma. That doesn't establish him as a full-fledged kohen because still there's a rumor out there that he's a grusha, the son of a grusha. So Gemara says, Pshita, of course, if that's the case, certainly that wouldn't establish him as a kohen. What's the novelty? So the Gemara says, Ma'u Desema, I would have thought in this case, the fact that Bezdin is giving truma to one of the brothers, some of the brothers who are real kahanim to eat, since the possessions that are going to the other brothers are meant that they should be eaten, hainami la'achila. So also the ones that are inherited by this ben gerusha, it's almost like Bezdin is like saying, a backhanded way, that really you're a kohen and you're also allowed to eat it. Kamash Milan, no. Hanach lachila. The Bezdin can decide, give truma, and yet for some brothers they can eat the truma. But for him, lezabuni, it means to sell. So it doesn't establish you as a kohen just because Bezdin gave you the right to inherit truma. You still need to establish yourself that you're not a ben gerusha. Okay, so that was the case. Okay, let's go back into the Mishnah for a second, and just so you see what the next Gemara is talking about, and that's the end of the Daf today. We learned in the Mishnah that, let's say you don't know a person. He's a Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, right? You don't know. So the Mishnah said, if there's one witness that says, I remember him from behind, right, that his grandparents were Kahanim, so Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein malan lekuna pi eidecha. If just there's one aid that says you're a kohen, we don't allow you to become a kohen. We don't allow this guy to go duchening. Amar Rab Lazar said, Ei Masai, when don't I trust him? B'mokam sheyesh orim. If there are two people that are saying that he's not a kohen. Aval b'mokam she'ein orim. But if there's no orim, means people who are challenging. Orim means challenging. If there's no challengers, so Rab Lezer says if there's no challenge, then even if there's one aid, you could establish him as a kohen. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, Rab Shimon ben Haskam. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel says in the name of Rab Chanina, the Rab Shimon, the son of Rab Chanina B'skana Kahanim, you could allow a person to become a kohen even if there's one aid. So the Gemara seems to ask a question: if there's no challenge, then Rab Lazar, who holds Malal Kuna Abi Eidechad, is saying the same thing as Rab Shimon ben Gamliel of Malal Kuna Abi Eidechad. So this is the Mishnah Daf Chav Gimel. So now let's see where we're holding on Daf Chav Vav. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ein Malal Kuna Abi Rab Shimon ben Gamliel Hein Rab Lazar. The Gemara asks a question on our Mishnah. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel and Rab Lazar are saying the same thing, that you're Malan Lakuna Abi Eidechad. The chitema, would you say there's a difference if there's one person challenging it? See, Rabbi Lezer, everybody we know from the Gemara understands now that Rabbi Lezer is more stricter. So Memela, the Gemara wants to at first say that the machlokes between Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Lezer is if there's one challenger, guy shows up, and there's one person, and he says he's a kohen. He has no proof yet. And one challenger says, I'm a witness that you're not a kohen. The Rab Lezer Savar, Ara Dechad. If he has one challenger, that's no good. In order to undo that one challenger, you need to have two Eidim to say that you are a kohen. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel Savar, Rab Shimon ben Gamliel holds, a challenge is with two Eidim. But if there's just one witness, then we ignore that challenge. So that would be the difference between Rab Lazar and Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. If one challenger is considered a challenge. So the Gemara says that cannot be the difference because Amar Rabbi Yochanan taught us, Divrei Hakol, everybody would agree, Ein aror pachas mishnayim. There's no such a thing of a call challenge unless there are two people. If there's no two people, then that's not considered a challenge. So when there is no, so then means that if there is no challenge, both Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Elazar hold, if there's just one aid, you can make him a kohen. So what's the difference between Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Elazar? Ella, says the Gemara, and here we're talking about like this. Now follow along because it's an interesting case. A guy shows up, right? And the muchsik lan ba'avu, he shows up in shul, and we know his father, the kohen. We know his father was a kohen, so we allowed him to be a kohen. Okay, he comes to the young Israel, he's a kohen, we give him the aliyah, everything is fine. Unafak alei kala, and then all of a sudden you read in the newspaper, we don't know where the rumor comes from. It's just the sound, the ben gerusha ben chalutza who, and that he's a ben gerusha ben chalutza. So everybody assumed this guy was a kohen, and they're giving him the truma, and now they're reading in the newspaper that he's a son of a grusha or a son of a chalutza. So he's a chalol, possibly. We don't know for sure because there's no aid in here. But this is more stronger than an aid echad. An aid echad is a totally discounted. But now that there's people schmoozing and it's made it to the papers, perhaps you have to take it seriously. So therefore, Achtinu, Bezdin temporarily suspended on when the SEC suspends trade in a stock. So they suspended him from taking truma until they investigate where this rumor is coming from. Then one aide comes to the Bezdin and says, Va'amar, and he says, I know for a fact that he's a kohen. So this one aide is not being challenged by anybody. He's just coming alone. So it's one aide versus a kala. So versus the sound. So we go to Chavav and Mebein. Va'askinu, they put him back to be the truma. They put him back to be the kohen. We ignored what was written in the paper. There's one aide that says you're a kohen. Fine. Next, Va'asu Beitrei, and then two people come, Va'amri, and they said, Ben Gerusha Ben Chalutzahu, that he is a Ben Gerusha or Ben Chalutza. Oh, so now you have a two challenging that one aid. Va'achtin Nehu, and then they totally suspended him. Okay, they suspended him because now you have two people saying that he's a Ben Gerusha and Ben Chalutza, so he's a chalal. He should not be eating truma. But Va'asa aid echad, but now another one aid comes, and he says, I know he's a kohen. So you had one aide saying he's a kohen, then two aides say he's not a kohen, and then one aide say he's a kosher kohen. So udukuli ama. So therefore, everybody agrees mitzdarfin le'edis that you can combine the one aide and the one aide, even though they didn't come at the same time. You can combine them as a group of two, even though they came on different days. But the problem is, so what's the argument? Really, you should have to say that if you combine 2 versus 2, you have two Eidim saying he's a Kohen, and you have two Eidim saying he's a non-Kohen. Put him on the chazaka that his father was a Kohen. Let him, we ignore the Eidim, we throw them out, and his chazaka is that his father was a Kohen. But the problem is that Rab Elazar is strict and says we don't make him a Kohen anymore. V'hacha, and here we're dealing with b'meiches lizulusa the beidina kumipalgi. Is Bezdin going to look shameful that they don't know what they're doing? Because look what happened to this guy. When there was a rumor, they suspended him. Then an aid had come, they reinstated him. Then two aidim come and say they suspend him. Now one aid comes and they want to reinstate him, so they suspended him twice. Bezdin is going to look bad, reinstating somebody who was suspended twice. Tanakama Sova, which is Rabbi Elazar, Kivid Achtini, since they suspended him, Loi Maskinele, we don't put him back. Chaishinin Lizilusa de Beidina, we're concerned how Bezdin is going to look, wishy-washy. Even though technically the letter of the law should require Bezdin to reinstate him, but since Bezdin is going to look like they don't know what they're doing, Rabbi Elazar was saying, don't reinstate him. Rab Shimon Gamliel Sava, Rab Shimon Gamliel says, Anan Achtinale. Bezdin will suspend somebody, but Anan Maskinale, they'll reinstate him according to what the law determines. We're not concerned about the reputation of Bezdin, how Bezdin is going to look, even though they look wishy-washy. So if that's the case, Maskif law Rav Ashi was troubled by this interpretation of the Gemara, that if you're dealing with one aid, why do you have to say that there's one aid then two aid, then one aid. Just have two aidim say that he's non-Kohen, and then two aidim come saying that he is a Kohen. And one aid in the beginning. I'm sorry, you have one aid in the beginning that says he's a Kohen. Two aidim say he's non-Kohen, and then have two aidim say that he is a Kohen. Why do you have to have one aid come at the end? In other words, this idea of having one aid and another aid saying things at different times, according to Rav Ashi, it's not a clear-cut halacha that you could combine them. And this is what Rav Ashi wants to do. Rashi explains it a little differently, and he says like this: the machlokes between Rav Shimon Gamliel and Rav Lezer, where Rav Lezer is strict and Rav Shimon Gamliel is easier, is b'mitzdarfin le'edus kol mipalgi. They're arguing whether you can combine two people who are saying edus at different times. Can you combine them to become one aid? According to these machlokes Tanoim, the Tanya we learned to the Brisa. First, we'll say like this. This has nothing to do with our Gemara, but it's all part of the Brisa. There's no edus that could be mitzdaref unless they're saying the same thing. You can have two people, and they're basically saying the same idea, but they're saying different things. One will say, I saw that so-and-so borrowed money. Okay. And then the other aide will say, so-and-so admitted to me that he borrowed money, but I didn't see the loan. So they're basically saying the same idea, that so-and-so owes money, but they're saying it for different reasons. One says he actually saw the loan, and one says he actually admitted to me that he owes money to somebody. So the Brisa says they don't combine as one pair of eidim until they're saying the same thing. Rabbi Shua ben Karchama, even if they're saying different things, they could still be combined. The ein edusa, this is the point. The ein edusa miskayemes achi idishtem keechad. They all have to say edus at the same time, even if they're saying the same thing. For example, in our case, when one aid is saying is a kohen, and then a few days later, another aid comes says he's a kohen. According to the Tanakama, they don't combine because they're saying edus on different days, and that's Rab Lezer's opinion in our Mishnah. But Rab Nosson says Shaimin Devar Shel Zeh Hayoim. You could listen to one testimony of one aid today, when his friend comes the next day, Shaimin Devarav, you could listen to his what he says, and if they're saying the same thing, even though they're saying edus on different days, you can combine them as one of the same. So therefore, that's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. That's what Rav Shimon ben Gamliel holds. Let's go back to the Mishnah and explain it. Rab Loza says, "B'mokum sheyesh av'mokum she'ein oirin." If the b'mokum sheyesh oirin, we don't trust. In other words, if there's two eidim that come, that's what he's saying. If there's two eidim that go against one aid that says he's a kohen, if there's a challenge by two eidim that say he's not a kohen, then even if another aid would come later on, we won't combine them, because as long as there's a challenge of two versus one at the very onset, we disregard another aid coming, because we don't combine aidim if they're not saying testimony on the same day. But Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, that means that even if one aid comes later on and combines with a previous aid who said testimony that he's a kohen days earlier, albeit in between a pair of Aiden said he's not a kohen, and these two Aiden came at different times saying the same idea that he is a kohen, but they didn't say it at the same time. Even though one aid came later on, you could bring this guy, make him back into a kohen and reinstate him as a kohen, because it's 2 versus 2, and you put him back on the chazaka. So that's how you explain the Mishnah. Let's just begin the let's say for the next minute, we'll just begin the Mishnah, because it's only 2 lines. Very new Mishnah, and we'll stop at the end of the Mishnah. Our Mishnah, as you know, a married woman, if she's married to a kohen, and she's raped against her will, she did znus, she's now prohibited on her husband. Yisrael will only be, if she's a Yisraelis, she's married to a Yisrael. If his wife was raped, then she doesn't become usher to her husband unless she did it willingly. She was mizana willingly as a married woman, then she becomes usher to her husband. So the Gemara Mishnah is talking about a woman was kidnapped by goyim. A married woman was kidnapped by goyim. Al yedei moimin, because the husband owed money. And the husband owed money. He borrowed money from the mafia and they kidnapped his wife. So it doesn't matter, mutaris labala, when he pays the money back and they give her back. So she's permitted to her husband, and we don't say that her captors took advantage of her and was mizana with her. Normally, a woman who's a prisoner of war, we say her captors, the goyim, were mizana with her. And if the goyim, if they were mizana with a Jewish woman, she would not be permitted to marry a kohen. But here, since they are afraid, they know the husband owed money, and they're afraid if they take advantage of his wife, he's not going to pay the money back. So therefore, she's mutaris labala. She's permitted to go back to her husband, even if the husband was a kohen, because we assume that the husband that they didn't take advantage of her. We're not, but again, it's only because the husband owed money. That's why they took her captive. If they just wanted to terrorize and take someone, kidnap somebody to extort money from the husband, that's then we don't say that. We say that they did take advantage of her. Al yedei nefashos, but let's say the goyim took this woman because she killed somebody, okay, or her husband killed somebody, and therefore they're now kidnapping her because they want to, in their courts, they want to have a whole judgment against this woman. So then asura labala, she's not permitted to her husband, not only if her husband is a kohen. Certainly they took advantage because she's a dead woman, because they already, she's assumed guilty that she killed somebody and they're going to kill her. So she's definitely, if she somehow gets released, she'll be prohibited for her husband, even when he's a kohen, because not only when he's a kohen, but even if he's a Yisrael, because perhaps during that time, in order to try to get her captors to let her go, she unwillingly was mizana with her captors. So if she eventually gets released, she's now prohibited to her husband, because an Ashes Ish that willingly was mizana while she's married, she's not permitted to go back to her husband. Okay, so that ended Daf Chav Vav.